By late May of 1862, the Union Army of the Potomac, under the command of Major General George McClellan, was camped within sight of the steeples of the Confederate capital at Richmond, and McClellan's army outnumbered the Confederate defenders, led by General Joseph Johnston, nearly 2-1. It seemed as if the terrible Civil War might be coming to an end. But 2 of McClellan's corps had crossed the swollen Chickahominy River and were isolated from the rest of the army, and Johnston saw a golden opportunity. The battle that followed would be desperate, confused, and exceedingly bloody, with the fate of the rebellion hanging in the balance. In his 1874 memoir entitled Narrative of Military Operations, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston wrote, "No action of the Civil War has been so little understood as that of 7 Pines." Joseph Johnston was born in Farmville, Virginia in 1807. In a period when historical events seemed always tied together, his father, Peter, a distinguished jurist and Virginia planter, had left college at age 17 to fight in the American Revolutionary War. He served under the famous Virginia cavalryman, Light Horse Harry Lee. Joseph Johnston's middle name, Eggleston, was named after his father's former commanding officer, Major Joseph Eggleston. Johnston's mother, Mary, was the niece of Patrick Henry. Johnston attended West Point, graduating in 1829. He served with honors in the Mexican-American War, the Seminole Wars, and as a quartermaster general in California in 1860. When Virginia seceded in April 1861, Johnston was the highest-ranking U.S. Army officer to resign his commission. Johnston had overall command at the July 1861 Battle of First Manassas, a Confederate victory, although more credit for the victory was attributed to his subordinate, P.G.T. Beauregard. Promoted to general, Johnston was given command of what was then called the Confederate Army of the Potomac, and had led the slow withdrawal following McClellan's 1862 Peninsula Campaign, an attempt to end the rebellion by capturing the Confederate capital via a massive amphibious landing on the Virginia Peninsula. Despite overwhelming numbers, Johnston, aided by McClellan's excessive caution, had slowed the Federal advance with stubborn defenses at Yorktown and Williamsburg. Johnston had a strained relationship with Confederate President Jefferson Davis and was under pressure. But he also recognized the opportunity when McClellan's 3 and 4 Corps were isolated. He created a plan to overwhelm the 2 corps. Johnston's plan was complex, but if executed correctly would bring 22 brigades, some 51,000 men in a coordinated attack that McClellan did not anticipate, against the roughly 33,000 men of 3 and 4 Corps. The battle would take place around the intersection of the Williamsburg and 9 Mile roads in Henrico County, Virginia, named by the locals for a distinct cluster of 7 large pine trees that grew at the crossroads, and Fair Oaks Station on the Richmond and York River Railroad. Confederates would call the battle 7 Pines. Union records would call it the Battle of Fair Oaks. The attack would first fall on the Federal 4 Corps under Major General Erasmus D. Keyes. Once 4 Corps was annihilated, 3 Corps under Samuel Peter Heintzelman, moving to support Keyes, would be similarly destroyed. The Milwaukee Morning Sentinel reported the enemy intended the battle to defeat and annihilate the left wing of the army. They took advantage of the rise in the river, rushing down an overwhelming force without artillery, hoping to complete the victory before our division could be reinforced. Captain George W. Mindle of the 61st Pennsylvania Infantry, part of 4 Corps, later recalled that Johnston's plan was faultless. Had this plan been fully executed, the left wing of McClellan's army would have sustained irreparable disaster, and the retreat of the whole Union army would have followed. The plan was perhaps tactically sound, but it collapsed almost from the start. Written orders were vague, and Johnston relied heavily on verbal instructions. Major General James Longstreet mistakenly moved his division down the wrong road, completely blocking the path of Major General Benjamin Huger's column. The debate over whether Longstreet's blunder was his own fault or the result of confused orders by Johnston raged on long after the war. Johnston had given Longstreet overall tactical command of the attack, but Johnston had failed to inform all his division commanders of that fact, leading to even more confusion. For hours, thousands of Confederate soldiers sat idle in a massive, muddy traffic jam. In addition, Peter Lübke explains in Encyclopedia Virginia, finally the weather contributed to Confederate difficulties, as wet and muddy roads slowed troop movement. The assault, intended to occur at dawn, didn't take place until 1 p.m. The division under Major General Daniel Harvey Hill, a close friend of Johnston and brother-in-law of famous Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, was supposed to initiate the attack at 8 a.m. With the army in disarray, Lübke writes, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the pugnacious and combative Hill launched the attack with his division, despite the fact that he had no idea whether any of the other Confederate elements had reached their assigned positions. When the attack came, it came quickly. Second Lieutenant Harrison Hume, acting adjutant of the 11th Maine, part of 4 Corps, recalled, "The first intuition we had of a battle was some shells thrown in the direction of our camp. But in 10 minutes after the picket firing commenced, the rebels were right upon us." Hill's men smashed the Union lines held by Brigadier General Silas Casey's raw, inexperienced division. Though Casey's men fought stubbornly, they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Confederates captured the Union earthworks and pushed the shattered Federal line back towards Seven Pines. The battle had begun. Hearing the signs of battle, McClellan finally reacted. This was partly due to the short-lived and underappreciated Union Army Balloon Corps. The enterprising aeronaut in charge of the Corps, Thaddeus Lowe, observed, "The enemy commenced to concentrate their forces in front of Fair Oaks, moving on roads entirely out of sight of our pickets and concealing themselves as much as possible in and behind woods, where none of their movements could be seen except from the balloon." The website of the U.S. Army notes that a French observer with the Union Army wrote, "There was some doubt whether the enemy was making a real attack or whether it was merely a feint, but this doubt was soon removed by reports from the aeronauts, who could see heavy columns of the enemy moving in that direction." McClellan quickly ordered Brigadier General Edmund Sumner to move his 2 Corps to reinforce Keyes and Heintzelman. But there was a problem. 2 Corps was on the wrong side of the river. The same rain that had delayed the Confederate attack had made the river crossing dangerous. The Confederates had destroyed most of the bridges across the river. Union troops had been engaged in building new bridges for the week before the battle. Civil War historian Jeffrey S. Williams writes on the website This Week in the Civil War that during the week McClellan had ordered 4 bridges built across the Chickahominy. Williams quotes the diary of Sergeant William Loughran of Company E of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry. "It was built of logs, cut near the banks by the men, and was completed before sunset, excepting a part of the corduroy approach on the north side, which was constructed by another regiment on the following day. As grapevines, which grew plentifully on the banks, were used instead of withes about its construction, it was called Grapevine Bridge." But the river had challenged the construction. Williams writes that Chaplain Edward Neal vividly recalled the storm that hit on the night of May 30th. There were constant rains, and on Friday night, the 30th of May, the windows of the clouds were wide open, and torrents of water poured out. Lightnings, like zigzag arrows of fire, darted to the earth, followed by long rolls of thunder. The superstitious might have supposed that there was a war in heaven. When Sumner arrived at the bridge, his chief engineer, Colonel Barton S. Alexander, advised against using the bridge, which by then was even at the waterline, and that he feared would not bear the weight of the regiments and artillery of Sumner's corps. Sumner, at age 65, the oldest field commander of an Army corps in the war, however, was under direct orders, and realizing the gravity of the situation, responded, "I can, sir. I will, sir. Sir, I tell you, I can cross. I am ordered." Alexander recalled the possibility of crossing was doubted by all present, including General Sumner himself. The chaplain recalled that the bridge trembled, undulated, and was ready to float away. But the so-called Grapevine Bridge lasted long enough to cross 5 Union brigades before it collapsed. It was, Williams writes, the only one of the 4 bridges that was able to withstand the floodwaters of May 1862. Those reinforcements were critical. Williams calls the bridge that saved an army. One of the first regiments to cross was the 1st Minnesota, the men who built it. Another unit to cross were the 12 guns of the light artillery battery of the 1st U.S. Artillery, under the command of Lieutenant Edmund Kirby. The reinforcements came at a desperate time. Brigadier General John Sedgwick, in command of the 2nd Division of Sumner's Corps, reported, "Upon debouching in the open field near Adams' house, we found Abercrombie's brigade of Couch's division sustaining a severe attack and hard pushed by the enemy." Sumner's arrival was perfectly timed, as Johnston had attempted to exploit the breakthrough by sending in Major General G.W. Smith's division near Fair Oaks Station. Sumner's freshly arrived troops deployed rapidly into a line. A fierce, close-range musketry battle erupted in the dense woods. The Federal reinforcements held the line, preventing a total Union rout. The battle was confused, desperate, and deadly. A soldier in the 3rd Michigan Infantry, part of the 3rd Division of Heintzelman's Corps, was quoted in the Milwaukee Morning Sentinel. About 1 o'clock p.m., we heard musketry and cannon to the front, apparently 3 miles away. General Barry ordered our brigade to fall in. The firing was now incessant, and the din of battle increased in volume every moment. A heavy rain the night before had softened the soil and level fields so that the traveling was very heavy. We approached the woods 1.5 miles from our starting point, passing guns and caissons stuck in the mud, both men and horses tugging vainly to draw them out. Wounded men on stretchers or supported by comrades met us at every step. Disaster was depicted on every countenance. Generals and their staffs rode hither and thither, aides and orderlies dashing hurriedly by. Cannonballs tore through the trees. Shells were bursting on every side. The roar of the battle in front was terrific. Among those struggling with the mud was Kirby's battery. 21-year-old Lieutenant Edmund Kirby had only graduated from West Point on May 6th, the same month as the battle. Kirby had come from a military family. His grandfather, Major General Jacob Brown, was a hero of the War of 1812, who had served as commanding general of the U.S. Army. His second cousin was Edmund Kirby Smith, a general in the Confederate Army who was at the time fighting in the Western Theater. Commissioned a second lieutenant, Kirby was promoted to first lieutenant just 8 days later and given command of the battery in the absence of Battery Commander James Ricketts, who was recuperating from wounds sustained the previous year. Despite his inexperience, Kirby showed his mettle at 7 Pines. A correspondent to the New York World reported, when Sumner crossed on Saturday afternoon, the roads on this side were so soft that nearly the entire artillery was stuck in the mud. But Lieutenant Kirby unlimbered his guns, put double teams to the limber boxes and then to the pieces, and literally lifted them out of the mud and dragged them to the battlefield. This was the only battery of that corps that got up that afternoon. But Kirby proved sufficient for the occasion. In his report, Kirby wrote, "I was ordered by General Sumner to place the battery 6 pieces in position, the right resting on a strip of woods and the left about 70 yards from Adams' house, facing nearly south and towards Fair Oaks Station. The enemy advanced to an open field and were about 1,000 yards from this battery when I commenced firing with spherical case and shell. They immediately tried to cover themselves in the woods on my right." The correspondent for the World wrote, "His brass Napoleons were served with great rapidity, and they poured shell and canister into the enemy with murderous effect." Seeing the situation, the Confederates tried to flank Kirby's battery, as yet unsupported by infantry, to defend it. Kirby wrote, "The enemy now prepared to charge my right. I advanced the left of the battery. They came down a road which was on my right when the firing commenced, and when they emerged from the woods found themselves directly in front of the battery instead of on the right, as they had expected, and were consequently subjected to a tremendous fire of canister from 5 light 12-pounder guns, which they were unable to stand. They retreated in disorder into the woods." The correspondent from the World explained, "The rebels charged Kirby repeatedly, but they were as often repulsed, and retired with their ranks terribly thinned." In the midst of the fight was a strange coincidence. Major General John Bankhead Magruder had grown up listening to war stories from his grandfather, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and uncle, a veteran of the War of 1812. He attended West Point and graduated in 1830. In the 1830s, he commanded a battery of the 1st Artillery, the battery now commanded by Kirby. Magruder, a Virginian, had sided with the Confederacy and was in command of one of Johnston's divisions. The correspondent for the World writes that Magruder was directing the rebel movements on their left, opposite Sedgwick's division. Kirby's battery was pouring heavy discharges of canister when Magruder caught sight of it, and by its old, peculiar, and faded Gideons at once recognized it as Light Battery I, 1st U.S. Artillery, formerly commanded by himself. He exclaimed, "By God's boys, that's my battery! Charge on it!" They obeyed. Once, twice, thrice they essayed an advance, but it was advancing to sure destruction. Kirby, with relentless severity and great accuracy, poured round after round of canister into them, and were finally swept back in great confusion. Seeing this, Magruder characteristically explained, "That fire is hotter than hell. The devil himself couldn't stand it. Boys, let's get out of this." Kirby's stand was remarkable, and showed the effect that artillery could have on a Civil War battlefield. Visiting the location where Kirby's battery played such havoc with the enemy after the battle, the correspondent for the World wrote, "The woods in this vicinity are completely cut to pieces. Every twig and shrub not above 2 inches in diameter is cut off, while every sapling and tree of larger growth is marked by at least half a dozen musket balls or canister shot. No stronger testimony of the heat of the engagement is needed than is given by the lacerated strip of lumber, unless it was the dead and wounded South Carolinians and Texans who were left on the field when the enemy finally retreated. The Union held the field, but only after taking heavy losses. Williams writes, as a result of the reinforcements from the Second Corps, the Confederate offensive was halted. One bridge, constructed by lumberjacks from Minnesota, had saved the day from McClellan's Peninsula Campaign. But there was one more event to note. Unable to hear the action and concerned that the attack had not started, Johnston rode towards the battle, coming upon fighting near Fair Oaks Station between Brigadier General William C. Whiting's division against the Federal right flank. Johnston moved to the top of a small hill to observe the battle. It was late in the day, 7 p.m. Johnston was struck by a minie-ball in the right shoulder. Almost immediately after, a shell, likely fired by a battery of the 1st Pennsylvania Light Artillery, exploded in front of him. A large fragment slammed into his chest with force enough to knock him off his horse. The wounds were serious, though ultimately not fatal. He was removed from the field, and command devolved to General Gustavus W. Smith. The battle continued on June 1st, made even more confusing by the collapse of the Confederate command structure. Confederate soldiers again attacked the reinforced and entrenched Federal troops, but made little tactical headway, and the battle fizzled into an inconclusive draw. The Confederates left the field. The Union flank hadn't been destroyed, but the attack on Richmond had been forestalled, and both sides claimed victory. The battle included a grim toll, more than 11,000 killed and wounded on both sides, the bloodiest battle of the war in the East up to that point. It was said that the stench of the decomposing corpses and the heat and the humidity was unbearable for weeks afterwards. But the battle had greater ramification than its inconclusive result. The Encyclopedia of Virginia notes that President Jefferson Davis, accompanied by his military advisor General Robert E. Lee, rode out to the field to assess the situation. They found Major General G.W. Smith overwhelmed by the responsibilities of command and suffering what appeared to be a nervous breakdown. At 1:30 p.m. on June 1st, President Davis made a decision that would fundamentally reshape the trajectory of the American Civil War. He relieved the ailing Smith and handed official command of the defense of Richmond to Robert E. Lee. Lee would command the Army of Northern Virginia throughout the remainder of the war. It was an irony to have Lee replace Johnston. Lee was the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, under whom Johnston's father had served during the Revolutionary War. The appointment of Lee fundamentally changed the trajectory of the war. A much more aggressive commander than Johnston, Lee engineered an offensive called the 7 Days Battles that forced McClellan into retreat. The Union would not get as close to Richmond again until nearly the end of the war, a bloody nearly 3 years later. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.